Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. You are Gershom Gorenberg, the famous Israeli journalist. You're in America right now to talk about your book. Let me hold it up. The Unmaking of Israel. Very pretty, understated design. And I think it's safe to say that everyone who cares about Israel's future should read this book, and probably everyone who cares about America's future, given how closely the fates of the two nations are intertwined. The book very much resonates with experiences I had during a visit to Israel and the West Bank a couple of months ago. There's actually one area where we differ, and that'll give us something to argue about later. I came away from the trip thinking that it may well be too late for a two-state solution, and we maybe have to think of a creative alternative. I know you don't think it's too late, so we can talk about that later, but leaving aside the prescriptive part of the book, as for the descriptive part, which consumes most of it, can you just start by telling us, I mean, maybe even if you can boil it down to one sentence, what message were you trying to send with this title, The Unmaking of Israel, and with the book itself?
The message I was trying to send is that Israeli policies, many of them adopted without a sense of what their long-term consequences would be, are threatening the existence of Israeli democracy and, in fact, undermining basic elements of statehood, of Israel's existence as an independent political entity. And since I care very deeply about Israel, it is my country, I'm very committed to its future, I want to warn of these things, suggest that these policies need to be changed, and at the end offer my own proposals for what changes are necessary in order to put Israel back on the right track, as I describe it, in order to create the second Israeli Republic.
I think that was technically one sentence, Gershom. Very good. A lot of words, but one sentence.
My editors always have problems with my sentence length. It's okay, Bob. You're in good company.
Well, notwithstanding the length of that sentence, the book is a very brisk history. See, it's not too thick. Very brisk history of how this came to be. Starts with the very creation of the Israeli state. But why don't you give us an example of two from more recent times, from the news, from the headlines, of what kinds of things are symptomatic of what you're calling the unmaking of Israel?
Well, one thing that's symptomatic of it is the thing that's called, that has the banal name, the price tag campaign. And this is a campaign by radical young settlers in the West Bank to exact a price from the surrounding Palestinian population whenever either there's an incident of violence against Jews for which the entire Palestinian population is then held responsible, or whenever the Israeli army on a rare occasion tries to enforce the law against the settlers. Well, what's going on here is, first of all, that very little has been done to stop this. The Israeli authorities in the West Bank have acted powerless, which means that there's no rule of law, a basic element of the state. It's going on in the West Bank, which is an area which Israel rules but is not part of the state of Israel, and the border between the West Bank and Israel is not marked on Israeli maps, so there you have another missing element of statehood. A state is defined, a modern state is defined by clear borders. Inside of these borders, it exerts power. If it's a democracy, inside of those borders, it governs by the consent of the governed. In the West Bank, a large proportion of the population has no role in the rule of the territory in which it lives, so that's undermining the democratic principle.
Meaning the Palestinians.
Correct. One of the reasons that the army has a difficulty in cracking down on this is because there are portions of the army which are have increasingly large numbers of soldiers who have been trained and brought into the army from the radical religious right, and there's a fear that these soldiers, now including many officers, would either ignore or not obey, or in other ways undermine orders from the civilian government to do what they're supposed to do because their political religious loyalties lie with the settlers. So there you have a situation where the government no longer has full control of the military, no longer has a monopoly on force. That's another aspect of losing basic elements of statehood. And finally, you have a situation in which an ethnic conflict is going on in a territory between two ethnic groups, albeit one with the semi-support of the state. But it's as if we had gone back to the period before Israeli independence, before 1948, when you had this outside power and the British ruling the particular piece of territory, and Jewish and Arab national movements were competing for control. So the situation is one in which Israel's continued rule of the West Bank, its treatment of the settlers, the increasing role of the religious right in the military, all of these things are harming the basic elements of statehood and of democracy.
And am I right in thinking that the price tag movement that you alluded to is actually spreading into Israel proper? The recent burning of a mosque in Israel was part of the price tag movement, right? And that was not in the West Bank.
Correct, and that's a very important point. When this burning of a mosque in northern Israel took place last month, there was tremendous shock because this was an attack on at least the property, the house of worship of people who are Israeli citizens. This conflict, which has become sort of routine in the West Bank, had come back into Israel. But my argument would be that the shock was misplaced because, in fact, one of the things which has been happening as a result of the continued occupation of the West Bank is that the thinking and the policies and the attitudes which have developed in the West Bank settlements are being imported back into Israel and creating greater conflict between Israeli citizens who are Jewish and Arab. Again, undermining a basic element of a modern democratic state, which is that it has to have equal treatment of all of its citizens.
Mm-hmm. And just to put a slightly finer point on the nature of the price tag movement, the people who did this, I think someone may have been apprehended, but in any event, the people who burned this mosque as part of the price tag movement weren't claiming that the people who worshipped at this mosque had done anything wrong. They were claiming that it was retaliation, but it's the nature of the price tag movement that you don't have to retaliate against the people against whom you have the grievance. And
right, this is a behavior in which you are treating each incident as part of a war between two ethnic communities.
Right.
So the
and a war with your own state, right? Because as you said, there's two kinds of provocations. There's things that Palestinians do that settlers don't like, and there's things that the Israeli government does that settlers don't like, and they will retaliate, I guess, for either of those against anyone, right?
Well, they most of the retaliations are against Palestinians, which is really a little bit nutty, which is to say that the Israeli army occasionally will obey orders from the courts to demolish illegal structures in settlements, and or there seems to be a chance that they're going to do this, or they'll arrest somebody who's been engaged in violence, and the perpetrators of the price tag actions will react by attacking Palestinian property and occasionally Palestinian persons, essentially saying to the government, if you try to crack down on us, we're going to stir up greater conflict here, so it's not worth your trouble to do that. We'll make things worse. They're using the Palestinian population essentially as hostages in their conflict with the government. Well, if the government doesn't prevent a group of people from using force for their political purposes outside of any government decision or justified cause, then the government is giving up its control of that territory. You're creating an area without a state.
Yeah, and in general, a theme. One thing you've alluded to here is a fairly pervasive theme in your book, which is really the breakdown of the rule of law in Israel. And your book makes it clear how kind of long ago this started. But your sense is that this is growing, right? I mean,
my sense is that, for instance, the phenomenon we were just discussing, the price tag situation, is more extreme than it was in the past. This has been a problem for many years. There was reports going back to the 80s on the failure to enforce the law against settlers in the West Bank, for instance. However, I think that at the present moment, it's gradually getting worse. Part of the reason for that is, as I said, a fear of fully using the existing law enforcement bodies, which in the territories, in the occupied territories, essentially means centrally the army, for fear of cracks in the structure of the army. Another reason for it is that the longer the settlement movement has gone on, and as we've moved from a first generation to a second generation of settlers, the second generation wants to outdo its parents at radicalism to show that they're not just bourgeois, settled-in establishment settlers, but real settlers. And some of the young settlers have never lived inside of the State of Israel, and they actually have much less commitment to sort of a common fate and a common polity than their parents did. And so they're willing to act in a much more radical way. The idea of the rule of law is more foreign to them.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned, well, certainly in your book, and I think you just mentioned, the fact that extremely religious people sympathetic to the settler movement are playing a larger role in the army. And raising the specter that you know, if there were finally some two-state solution that demanded that the army, in some cases, forcibly remove settlers, that people might just refuse to obey those orders. Soldiers might. There's also, when I was there were people commenting on how the character of Jerusalem had changed. Many more ultra-Orthodox, and we should say, for the record, you're actually Orthodox, but we're talking about the ultra-Orthodox, people who, you know, dress in black and the whole thing, how much more a part of the landscape they are in Jerusalem. And it's now to the point where on Saturdays there's a lot of places where you really can't drive a car, at least some places, because the people in the neighborhood won't put up with that violation of what they see as religious law. And there are a lot of kind of secular people who are increasingly secular Israelis who are alienated by what's happening in Jerusalem. When I was there, I heard one kind of prominent journalist saying he feared that Israel was becoming a theocracy. Do you think that's overblown?
I think that's overstating the case, but I do want to say that what has happened is that political coalitions with clerical parties of two varieties, the ultra-Orthodox and the highly nationalist Orthodox settlers of the territories, has led to a situation in which governments who created those alliances for short-term political reasons of convenience have actually promoted extremist trends. For instance, in the case of the ultra-Orthodox, there were reasons early in statehood where it was convenient for secular parties to create ruling coalitions with ultra-Orthodox and Orthodox parties. And by doing so, they provided all sorts of funding for the institutions of those communities. And by providing that funding, they encouraged, for instance, the ultra-Orthodox community to become more and more cut off from the general society, to provide less and less secular or general education to its children, to depend more on government funding so that men could spend their whole lives studying. And so one of the things that the state has done, which disturbs me deeply as a religious Jew, is it's led to greater extremism in religion. It's led to a picture of religion which I think is deeply distorted. And I think that that's one of the risks here. The marriage between religion and state was not made in heaven. It's not good for either one of them. That's one of the lessons I think that we can learn from the current situation, and that leads to one of my central recommendations, which is that that synagogue and state should be divorced, that the government should remove itself from the field of religion. Yeah.
There is this, I wanted to ask you kind of what Zionism means to you in that, you know, because on the one hand, you want it sounds like an essentially democratic, secular state. At the same time, I assume you would call yourself a Zionist. At any rate, it seems to be part of embracing the two-state solution, as you do, is often an idea to hang on to some of the spirit of Zionism and for Israel to be, in some sense, a Jewish state. And I guess I'm wondering how you kind of reconcile what seem to me almost conflicting, or at least impulses that are at some tension. I mean, it's a delicate balance you're talking about, right?
Well, I think that Zionism is a form of nationalism. There are all sorts of stripes of nationalism. There are liberal ones and conservative ones. I am a liberal Zionist. I see the idea of a Jewish state as an expression. Here I'm quoting from the Israeli political philosopher Chaim Gantz to some extent. In its liberal mode, a national movement says that one aspect of people's identity and one aspect of their individual rights is to have a place where in the public sphere they can express their culture, or at least argue about what their culture is. And in order to do that, you need a degree of political independence. And so in my mind, what Israel has provided Jews is a space where the public place, where the public arena is Jewish by dint of the fact that there's a large Jewish majority.
So it would just be kind of de facto a Jewish state in the way that America, some people would say, is de facto a Christian state, or is it more than that?
Well, I think when you have a situation in which the language of the majority is Hebrew and the calendar that determines much of society is the Jewish calendar because that's the calendar that's important to most of the people. And yes, also to the extent that because Jewish history is the history of the majority of people, it's going to be taught because that's what people do, that you have a Jewish state. You do not have to, for instance, and here you don't have to have the state define for you whether being Jewish is a secular nationality or a religious identity, for instance. I think that the ideal situation in a Jewish state is that there's great freedom for people to argue publicly as members of the majority what it means to them to be Jewish and how that should be expressed. And when I'm talking about making the state, taking the state out of the religion business, I'm saying that that's good, not because I'm opposed to religion, but because I'm for it. I will say as an aside here that sociologists of religion with whom I've spoken have said that the reason that the United States is the Western country with the highest degree of religious participation is explicitly and clearly because there's no established religion in America, and that allows and forces religious groups to innovate, to do what they can to make themselves relevant to the public. They can't depend on state funding to keep their institutions going. They have to be something that people want to come to. And I think that the current situation in which the state of Israel is supporting the specific religious institutions is actually doing a great deal of damage to religion. The reason I want the state to be secularized is not because I want religion to vanish from Israeli society. It's because I want a free market of ideas on religion as well, which I think will be very healthy for Jewish religion and will allow a lot of varieties, pluralism, innovation, all of which will be good. Will be good for the Jews, as it were.
Maybe I hope this isn't redundant to put the question this way about Zionism. You're skeptical of alternatives to a two-state solution, and toward the end of the book, much of your skepticism seems to come from considering the alternative, the main alternative, well, I guess maybe the only alternative, being some sort of one-state solution, and finding that just not workable in your view. I guess I'd say, to what extent is your embracing the two-state solution derived from the sheer unfeasibility of the alternatives, as opposed to a conviction that there's something in the spirit of Zionism that just deserves preserving? In other words, if it could work out, that if you did think a one-state solution could work out, and you could wind up with a democratic secular state, and whatever the balance of ethnicities between Arab and Jew, neither would abuse any majority status and everything would work out wonderfully, would you say, okay, let's do it? Or again, do you think that there's something in Zionism that's just inherently worth hanging on to?
Those are two things that are difficult to untangle. First of all, because on the one hand, yes, I do think that it is valuable and worthwhile for Jews to have a place where they are in the majority and the public space is mainly Jewish. I think that one of the things that's worthwhile for Jews is that also creates a space in which their commitment to the values of respecting others and respecting the minority are tested and allowed to be carried out. But I do think that that's a positive thing. Beyond that, though, I also think that the great majority of Jews and Palestinians living between the river and the sea want self-determination as national groups. And so speaking of this theoretical state in which everybody's just they're citizens of the Eastern Mediterranean Republic and they're being Jewish or Palestinian is a private matter for them, I think that's it's not even utopian, it's fantasy land, it's imaginary, it's not satisfying to the vast majority on either side. So what you would have in that situation is two highly politicized, highly nationalistic communities living within a state structure that would be incapable of dealing with their conflicts. It would take all of the issues which are currently a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians and turn them into domestic issues between two communities of virtually equal size, and in the best case would lead to political paralysis, and in the worst case would lead to continued violence. So I guess to sum up, yes, I see a value in Jews in a Jewish state. I see a value for Palestinians in a Palestinian state, to be fair about this. But since I'm talking from within the Israeli context, I put more emphasis on what I think is that a two-state solution is in Israel's interest. And along with that, I also think that the word solution should not be attached to the words one state. I will acknowledge, even before you bring up the point, that reaching a two-state solution poses tremendous difficulties, some of which you've already mentioned here. For instance, in order to reach a two-state solution, Israel would have to evacuate at least most of the settlements. In order to do that, it has to deal with settler violence, and in order to do that, it also has to take strong measures to reestablish the civilian government's control of the military. Those are really difficult things, but I sort of feel that when somebody says, well, that's just too difficult, it's like somebody saying to me, this chemotherapy thing, it's just so painful, I can't do it. And to which the doctor will say, you're right, it's really miserable. Now I'm going to discuss with you what the alternative to this chemotherapy is.
Right.
And at that point, most people
you're kind of loading your metaphor here against people who disagree with you, because in the case of cancer, there is no known alternative to the conventional treatment.
Well, what I'm saying is that a one-state, quote, solution, unquote, is not a workable solution. It's an act of political suicide by both groups.
Gershom, let me give you an advisory that I will share with our viewing public, which is that my phone is doing these weird battery noises. If we get disconnected, I'm just going to stay on, keep recording, and I will call you from Skype at your phone number, okay?
Okay.
And maybe we'll cut this out, and maybe we'll leave it in for the sheer dramatic value of it. But if that happens, keep cool.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, but I mean, and I admit that it's not that I see some easy path to a one-state solution. It's just that both when I was in Israel, and especially the West Bank, and when I read your book, I became aware of the extent to which the egg is scrambled, right? I mean, the extent to which the Israeli presence in the West Bank is a very fine-grained and tenacious and interconnected presence. Right. Actually, I think I will call you back on Skype, because if only because I'm annoyed by the sound of this battery. So just hang on and hang up, and you'll get a phone call. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Good. Okay. All right. So we're back after a brief, technically related interlude. But you and now you've had time to come up with a devastating answer to my assertion that it may be that there's no unscrambling the egg at this point, right? I mean, there is a really pretty dense network of settlements. They are often interconnected by roads that Palestinians can't travel on, which just slices up the Palestinian territory. And beyond that, many of the settlers would fiercely resist any attempt to move them. And moreover, there doesn't seem to be any political will in Israel to ask them to leave anyway. There's not much interest in the problem, as far as I can tell, in mainstream Israeli political discourse. Israel's pretty, there hasn't been a big terrorism problem lately, and there's no urgency for a two-state solution, no sense of urgency. So I just don't, it's hard for me to imagine what could create the amount of political will in Israel that it would take to untangle this mess, even assuming such a thing is doable.
Well, I think I have to throw the question back at you. If at the moment there is a sense of despair about the political process, which makes it difficult to go forward to a two-state solution, there is no political will whatsoever for a one-state solution. I think that the despair at the moment is created in large part because there doesn't seem to be a way forward, and when people feel that something is stuck and they can't do anything about it, it tends to go down on their political radar. So, for instance, there's been a very positive development in Israel in recent months of major economic protest. But that protest has not touched even the economic side of the settlement problem because people feel that there's nothing they can do about it.
Well, and because it would be politically divisive, which is kind of my point, that even within the left on Israel, you can't start talking about settlements and Palestinians because that'll split even the left down the middle. And that's what I mean about the seeming hopelessness of amassing the political will across the Israeli spectrum to actually do something about this problem.
Well, I would put it differently. The economic left and the dovish side of Israeli politics don't line up precisely. And the people organizing the social protests said, why should we only take the intersection of the two sets? As a movement, you can do that. When it comes to the point of elections, it will be impossible to do that because a political party needs to take positions on more than one specific issue. The political situation right now is at a stalemate within Israel. I would say that you should be careful of taking still pictures. I've seen many, many moments in the last 34 years in Israel where it seems in a particular week that nothing is going to happen, and then big things happen. The week before Rabin and Arafat announced mutual recognition of each other, everybody in Israel was convinced that the peace process that had begun at Madrid was absolutely stopped and dead. Taking a long view here, I wouldn't take the events of a week or a month or even a year as being determinative. Looking at the long picture, 20 years ago, if you said in Israel that you were in favor of a two-state solution, you were on the radical left, you weren't legitimate. Today, that's a mainstream position. And I would add that 25 years ago on the Palestinian side, if you said you were in favor of a two-state solution, you could get shot for it. And today, it's a mainstream position. And people who 20 or 25 years ago on the Palestinian side who would not possibly have considered the idea of a two-state solution and living side by side with Israel have not only accepted that idea but become proponents of it. I remember having a conversation earlier this year with he called himself, I am from the Arafat Fatah, one of the people who came back from the Palestinian diaspora with Arafat in the 1990s, a Fatah official in Ramallah, and he was an avid supporter of a two-state solution. I guarantee you that if either of us had the chance to interview him 25 years ago in Lebanon, he would have said a two-state solution is absolute treason to the Palestinian cause. So over time, positions over more of a time than a stay in Israel or reading 3 months newspapers, positions on both sides have changed drastically.
I've actually been at least reading the newspapers a little longer than that, but
no. But what I mean is that we tend to be caught up in the immediate event.
I was actually in Israel during the first Intifada in late '88, and it just seems to me, in a fundamental sense, things have gotten in many ways just a lot worse. I mean, this fundamental fact on the ground that there's just tons of settlements and illegal outposts populated by fiercely tenacious people who believe they're doing God's will, that's just gotten a lot worse. This is a trend. It's not a snapshot. And it's not that easy to imagine. It's really not that easy to name things. The one thing you say has gotten better since then is if you look at the percentage of people on both sides who say they're for a two-state solution. But let's look at what they mean by that. I mean, on the Israeli side, there's this view that, we've given them these great two-state offers, but every time we offer them a state, they don't go for it. Arafat in whenever 2000 or whatever that was at Camp David and so on, they just never go for it. But if you look at the offers that have actually been put on the table, they're not ones I would expect Palestinians to accept because they really don't generally involve the creation of a state in the conventionally understood sense of the word. To me, a state means something where if you have a state, you control the borders, you control the airspace. These things are taken for granted. They're part of the meaning of a state. And yet, as I understand it, everything that's ever been offered to the Palestinians has not involved those things. And in fact, there's just this kind of paradox in what actually gets offered to the Palestinians, which is that, on the one hand, you'd think the premise of a two-state solution is that, okay, these two sides can learn to live next to each other and trust one another. And yet, when you look at the details of what is offered to the Palestinians, the implication is the Palestinians are going to have to trust the Israelis, who are going to have all of this ongoing power that normally is reserved for an actual state. But the Israelis can never trust the Palestinians, okay, in perpetuity. The Palestinians can never be trusted with their airspace, their borders. They can never have a military. And, I understand how maybe if I were Israeli, I would think that's a great offer. But I think if you put yourself in the shoes of the Palestinians, it's a really terrible, humiliating offer, right? So if you look at what the two people mean by two-state solution, I don't think they're anywhere near on the same page.
Well, this is sort of taking me away from a critical point that I'm trying to make here and in the book, but I'll try to respond to that briefly. I think that if you look at the history of the negotiations, the gaps have narrowed. I think that if Ehud Olmert had not been charged with major corruption charges in 2009, that the likelihood of an agreement between him and Abu Mazen was very high. The gaps between them were steadily shrinking. They had agreed on key points that two leaders had not agreed on before. And I think that when there's an opportunity to negotiate again, there is a possibility of going past that one. Each of the agreements that has not quite gotten there has several years later led to a new round of negotiations, which has come closer. Regarding the settlements, I would agree with you. Removing settlements is really difficult. I would also say keep that in perspective. The outpost settlers, for instance, you're talking of a population of somewhere in the area of 3,000 to 4,000 people. The question is not is the Israeli army capable of removing those people? The question is, can we reach a political decision to do that? My argument is that normally when the discussion of this issue is raised in the context of people who support Israel, who support Israel's existence, whatever, they tend to look at it as Israel is giving up land for peace. And what I'm arguing is Israel desperately needs for its existence as a state and a democracy to unentangle itself from that land, and peace is the means of doing that. And that therefore, we need to reframe our way of looking at the peace agreement. It's not that we're making this terrible concession by giving up the West Bank. We're doing something which is essential for Israel's future, and then in the course of negotiations, we're trying to work out the mechanics of doing that in a safe manner. Because, why do I mean in a safe manner? Because when Israel has tried, as some diplomacy-challenged leaders have done in the past, to leave territory on a unilateral basis, as Israel did when it pulled out of South Lebanon and as it did when it pulled out of Gaza, it left territory on its borders under the control of highly hostile groups. And that turned out to be very dangerous. I mean, that's why missiles are falling in cities in southern Israel. That's a bad way of leaving territory. That doesn't mean it's bad for us to leave that territory, but doing it unilaterally without an agreement, empowering the radicals, is a bad way to do it. If you understand that leaving the territory is essential for Israel's interests, then your next question is, okay, how can we approach the people on the other side who are in favor of a diplomatic solution and work with them to get there? And I'll just give you one example of that. You have a situation right now where Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, the leader of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, was on Israeli television a few days ago and said, we Arabs made a mistake in 1947 when we didn't accept the partition plan. We should have accepted that. And he's saying, okay, that's a huge admission for an Arab leader to make. He's saying, when I'm going to the UN or when I'm going to engage in negotiations with you, I'm trying to reverse that historical error. I want a two-state solution. So instead of treating Abu Mazen's diplomatic steps as some kind of threat to Israel, people who are in Israel or who support Israel abroad, including people who are in the American administration or the American Congress, should be regarding those moves as highly hopeful moves for the state of Israel and supporting them and encouraging, urging, arm wrestling with the current right-wing government in Israel to take a more positive attitude toward them.
Okay. I should amend what I said is I think it's not that there's no chance of a two-state solution. What I do believe is that the only chance for a two-state solution is if people start taking seriously the prospect of a one-state solution. So if Palestinians in this new kind of nonviolent resistance movement in the West Bank start doing something that they're not doing now and they're kind of averse to doing for reasons we needn't get into, but just standing up and demanding the right to vote in Israeli elections, say, look, it's clear you want all the land, fine, we just want to vote. I think that might well might galvanize Israeli political discourse in a way that could ultimately lead to a two-state solution. But that's just a...
I would take this one step further than what you just did. I think, you talked about apathy on the Israeli side, and outside of some wonderful young people who were involved in what was called the March 15th movement last year, pushing for Palestinian reconciliation, there's been a huge amount of political apathy on the Palestinian side. Part of that has to do with the fact that the Second Intifada showed in very clear fashion that the myth of armed struggle was not going to succeed in getting Palestinian independence and did tremendous damage to Palestinian society. And moving from that to a model of nonviolent protest and resistance has still not taken on the dimensions of a mass movement. So part of the ball here is also on the Palestinian side. The idea of nonviolent, of truly nonviolent resistance, is that you're promoting, you're taking into account that in politics as well, the medium is the message. By protesting and demanding independence in a nonviolent fashion, you're also indicating that your goal is not destroying the other side, but freeing yourself from the other side. It is, to use the concepts of Martin Luther King and, for that matter, of Gandhi, it is to liberate the other side from being an occupying force. And I think that the apathy, that the lack of mass political involvement on the Palestinian side is also, like the lack of mass political involvement on the Israeli side, is doing both sides damage.
Yeah, I think we agree there. The apathy may have different causes. I think in Israel, a lot of it is that for many Israelis, things are going pretty well. They're secure. The security fences made a big difference. Tel Aviv seems prosperous, and so on. So the causes are different, but I think you're right. If you look at the political forces on both sides that could ultimately make the kind of difference we'd like to see made, they do not command a large following right now. Although on the Palestinian side, I came away modestly hopeful that, you could see growth as
I'm not saying that it can't happen, and I've met people on the Palestinian side who I found incredibly impressive, who want to make that happen. As I've met young, active Israelis who are also very impressive. But to come back to where we started, part of the reason, the central reason that I wrote this book was to say, take a longer historical perspective. Mm-hmm. Right now, your high-tech firm is doing well. Well, your high-tech firm is not going to do well, and your personal existence is not going to be so great if you ignore the long-term consequences of the processes going on right now. And those processes include the fact that your government is empowering extremists, that the military, which is unfortunately, but in reality basic to Israel's existence, is being increasingly dominated by more extreme forces. The settlers are continuing to expand. Those are long-term threats. So look beyond your monthly paycheck and wake up and start responding. And I'm also saying to an English-speaking readership that people who are concerned about Israel, and that does not exclude people who are concerned about the Palestinians, because I think that the one respect in which there's a single reality, a unified reality here, not a one-state reality, but a unified reality, is that we're going to sink or stay afloat together. Either the future is going to be good for both Israelis and Palestinians, or it's going to be bad for both Israelis and Palestinians. This is not a zero-sum game. It's the opposite of that. So people who are concerned and have a basic concern for what's going on in the Middle East, and as you said, that includes concern for American interests, because Israel and the occupied territories are they're the keystone of the arch of the Middle East, should be pushing for diplomatic solutions rather than sitting back and saying, oh, gee, it's so awful, there's nothing we can do about it. Or, gee, it might hurt me, I might lose 12 votes in the next election if I dare to raise this subject.
Yeah, let's don't even get into the depressing subject of the current American political climate.
You want to stick with the depressing Middle East so that you don't have to look at things
really.
another way.
No, it's worse. It's worse. Don't get me. I can't take that right now. This
whole conversation, Bob, is actually an act of repression for you, so that you can stay away from your problems at home.
And it just failed. The exercise just failed. Let me ask you a question about the historical account in the book. There's a kind of a narrative tension that I think reflects probably the reality of the way the history is unfolded. And this is consistent with, and in some ways an extension of the story you tell in your book, The Accidental Empire, which is a very fine-grained account of just how the settlement thing actually happened. In both cases, you sense that, on the one hand, and this is what the term accidental and accidental empire means, on the one hand, there was the whole thing wasn't planned. It's not like there was a meeting at some point where a bunch of Israelis in the government said, our goal is to take over the whole West Bank, and here's how we're going to do it. I mean, there may have been individuals who did that, but that was never, that has not been a coherent guiding force in Israeli governance. On the other hand, there has been, the government has been repeatedly implicated in the sense that time and again, for whatever reason, reasons of political convenience or whatever,
Political
it has a
short-sightedness.
Yeah, but it has assisted the settler movement. So on the one hand, there's no kind of long-standing centralized plot that is unfolded to get us into the mess we're in. On the other hand, it's also misleading to say, well, if it weren't for these several crazy settlers, we'd be fine. Because the fact is that for various reasons, the settlers have repeatedly gotten support from the government, right?
The settlement project could not have begun in the first place without the government. It was in many ways initiated by government officials, even though there was a vacuum of government decisions and policy, and it could not continue without ongoing government support. That is correct. I think that one of the critical elements in this is that settlement of the land was a value for very understandable and useful reasons before Israeli statehood. And there is a pattern in the history of nations that means which worked well, which served well at another stage in history become sanctified and hold on and become very, very damaging at a later point. I can understand why in Kansas in 1860 somebody thought that it was a good idea to walk around with a brace of 6 guns, and even to walk into the saloon that way, because there was no law and it was unsafe and you had to do what you had to do to keep yourself safe. But I don't understand why that would give somebody the right to walk into a Starbucks on Broadway with a brace of 6 guns, and I think that would be a very bad thing for a modern urban society. So why does that idea of your right to bear arms, why does that hold on in American society? Because it was something that was sanctified at an earlier stage of American history where it actually made sense. Settlement was sanctified at an earlier stage in Israeli history when it made sense. Continuing to pursue it today is deeply, deeply damaging to Israeli society. And it's also damaging to values that Israel holds, which I think are longer-standing values. The value of democracy, the value of equality, the values that were also basic to creating the State of Israel. In some respects, I think in many respects, Israel is really stunningly unusual among the countries that became independent after World War II, and the fact that it's had continuous parliamentary rule, and the fact that the judicial branch has exerted restraint upon the legislative and executive branch. Those are things that sort of get taken for granted, but are really surprising. But they're threatened by holding on to these pre-state values, such as settling the land, continuing to expand, continuing the conflict with the other ethnic group. So I think we have to make choices. I don't think that we're unusual in that. I'm sitting right now in New York in a country that's got a political movement called the Tea Party, which hasn't noticed that the Boston Tea Party was a great idea, but after that the United States became independent and the people exerting the taxes were not the British monarchy, but the American government. So, Israelis are not unusual in taking a little bit of time to understand that the revolution has taken place and now you have to behave responsibly. But I'll leave your mishigas, your craziness aside, and stick with my homegrown craziness. We have to get over the settlement ethos. We have to get past that, not just because the Palestinians don't like it, but because it's bad for Israel.
Okay. Is there, before we sign off, is there anything else, any basic dimension of the book that we have failed to address, or any spicy controversial issue we failed to discuss? Actually, I know what I could ask you about. Judge Goldstone just a couple days ago did this op-ed addressing the issue of whether Israel is an apartheid state, right, and rebutting the allegation that it is. He's, of course, wrote and then kind of recanted on the very controversial Goldstone report about the Gaza war. What's your view on that question?
I would say this is something I mentioned in the book. Tolstoyan about this. Every unhappy country is unhappy in a different way. And borrowing the concepts from elsewhere doesn't advance the discussion, doesn't lead to a more precise analysis. It harms the discussion. And I also think that, ironically, many people who consider themselves to be progressives are very conservative in the sense that they're fighting the last battle. Either they were born too late for it, or it worked the other time, so they just want to take those terms and apply them. So there was an anti-apartheid struggle, including within South Africa and beyond South Africa, and it worked. And so there's people who want to apply the conceptual framework and the precise methods to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I don't think they're doing Israelis or Palestinians any good. The occupation and continued Israeli rule of the West Bank are things which are bad for Israel and bad for the Palestinians. And let's stick with those terms and look at the situation as it is, instead of trying to cram that into the frame of some other conflict. I don't think it's just bad analysis. It doesn't advance us. And trying to use the exact same tactics sometimes is also can be it's nostalgic and it's wonderful, and we can do that again, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're being politically effective. Apartheid is the wrong word. I think that that's true. That doesn't mean that the situation is good. It just means that that's the wrong word. It's the wrong diagnosis for this particular illness. And if you give the wrong diagnosis, you're likely to give the wrong treatment. In fact, to connect to our previous discussion, the right treatment for apartheid was one person, one vote. That is not the right treatment for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The right treatment for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been sitting on the table since 1947, and that is partition of the land between the river and the sea into two states, so that both Jews and Palestinians can enjoy self-determination. And using the terminology from elsewhere confuses the issue and makes it more difficult for people to see the way forward.
Okay.
I would like to add one other thing, though, in response to your question about other things that are in the book, which is that you mentioned that the book starts out with a description of the early years of Israel. And for me, that was also a very important part of the book, which is that I went back and looked at how Israel's original democratic structures were created. And I think that that's a story which is, first of all, a fascinating story. And also what it shows is that the country was born with a lot of contradictions, which I think also is something that the American reader can understand. I mean, we're talking in a country that started off as a revolutionary democracy and as a state that sanctioned slavery. Okay, that's the American story. And it had to get past one part of its heritage. It's still fighting in some ways with one part of its heritage to realize the other part of its heritage. So Israel was born as part of an ethnic conflict, and it was also born as a country that made tremendous efforts to be a democracy. For instance, in the book I described the 1953 Supreme Court case in which the Israeli Supreme Court essentially imposed freedom of speech on the state of Israel. Not at all coincidentally, the presiding judge at the time was one of the rare American immigrants to Israel at the time who imported American free speech law as a package, as a precedent into Israeli law. Another thing which I discovered doing the research, which is part of an ongoing historical controversy, has to do with the issue of what happened in 1948. And as you're well aware, there's a huge historical controversy about what exactly led to the Palestinians becoming refugees in 1948. I'm not going to try to open up that whole discussion now. My reading of the historical evidence is that there were certainly places where Israeli units conducted expulsions of Palestinians. There's many other places where Palestinians fled because that's what people do during wartime, and after the war they were not allowed to return. But one thing that I found, which I was not expecting to find and was fascinating, was the blueprint the administrative blueprint for the State of Israel, which was written in the months before the state was established, was completed a few weeks before Israel declared independence in the midst of the war, the communal war between Jews and Arabs that was already going on. And that administrative blueprint, which was intended purely for internal use, presumes the continued presence of the full Arab population. And that blueprint was written by the top leaders of the Jewish side. The committee that wrote that blueprint was chaired by David Ben-Gurion, the founding Prime Minister of Israel. And the first page of it says, we are taking into account the presence of a large Arab population in the Jewish state. We understand that they may not cooperate with us at the beginning, but we have reserved places in the state structure for them, and we hope that with time they will integrate themselves into the state structure. It talks about the number of schools that are needed in what it describes as Arab towns, and those are towns that were not Arab towns after the 1948 war. And so this goes back to one of the things that you said before about to what extent is there strategy and to what extent do things happen out of the complex interplay of events without anybody exactly planning that that's what was going to happen. What I learned from this is that despite the many bad things done on both sides in 1948, Israel did not go into that war with a plan to expel the entire Palestinian population. I didn't go looking for that. Somebody suggested to me that this would be an interesting document to look at in terms of the history of Israeli democracy. The person who recommended it had no idea what was in it, and it was one of the days that I really enjoyed, sorting through old documents, because I had the pleasure of discovering something that I had no idea was there, and I think is really historically significant. Yeah.
Now, the history of the book is great, and most of it is much closer to contemporary history than that. And it really is a case where understanding the situation we're in is integrally related to understanding how we got here. So
I just want to tell you, though, Bob, among Israelis and Palestinians, 1948 is always contemporary.
You're right. Yes.
I mean, 1948 is never the past,
right,
in either Israeli or Palestinian dialogue. The reason I mentioned that incident, you said, "Oh, Gershom, he's bringing up this thing from 63 years ago. He's acting like this academic historian." I'm saying, no. If you're dealing with the present-day Israeli-Palestinian conflict, 1948 is always in the present, and therefore, looking what happened in 1948 is really critical for discussing now.
It is and it isn't. I remember one of your very first blogging heads encounters, which was with a correspondent from Al Jazeera, in which you two kind of agreed that the two sides, the Palestinians and the Israelis, are always going to have different narratives probably, and maybe in some ways it's best for them not to discuss the two narratives too much. In other words, for them to leave to each other the right to have their own narrative and not let that get in the way of a settlement.
Oh, I agree with you in the sense that in terms of political negotiations, you're not going to negotiate away the fact that two different national groups have different tellings of their tragically intertangled history. I think that at such point as Israelis and Palestinians succeed in making peace, and I hope it's very soon, that they will discover that their narratives of the past are changing, because that's what happens to history. It's constantly being rewritten from the viewpoint of the present. But I also think that within the context of discussion, of understanding the conflict and trying to make sense of it, that one should not shy away from researching those controversial aspects of history which are so emotionally loaded. And if you find something that's new about it, it's
absolutely
you understand things better, and it's fun.
And it is the journalist's and historian's mission.
Right.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, and it's a great book. Good luck with it.
Thank you, Bob.
And we'll see you next time.
Okay, great.
All right. Bye-bye.